Have you ever felt like your life was already failing at 20? In this video, I will tell you my real story, how confusion, broken confidence, and simple English mistakes followed me all the way to America. But something strange happened along the way. The same failures that embarrassed me slowly built my future, my love story, and the life I never expected. So what really happens after failure? Let's find out. Failing at 20 changed everything. At 20 years old, I was already convinced my life was going in the wrong direction. Not the dramatic kind of failure you see in movies. No big accident. No shocking disaster. Just a quiet, heavy feeling that everyone else was moving forward while I was standing still. And strangely, that quiet failure became the first brick in a life I never imagined I could build in the United States. This story is not about perfect English. It is not about fast success. It is about something slower and more human, learning, failing, loving, and slowly building a life in a new country. At 20, my English was honestly a mess. I could read some simple sentences. I could understand basic words. But when real people spoke, especially Americans speaking quickly, it felt like they were using a completely different language. My brain would freeze. Someone would say, "How's it going?" and I would panic for 3 seconds trying to remember if the correct answer was yes, good, or just a smile. Sometimes I simply nodded like a confused robot. And that moment, when you know a language but cannot use it, creates a strange kind of loneliness. Psychologists actually talk about this feeling. When people cannot express themselves clearly, the brain experiences something similar to social rejection. Your mind begins to believe a dangerous story: you are not good enough. At 20, I believed that story. I watched other people speak confidently. I watched them laugh easily. I watched them build opportunities with conversations that looked so natural. Meanwhile, I was fighting with simple sentences. And somewhere inside my head, a quiet voice kept repeating, "Maybe this is not for you." But life is funny. Sometimes the moment you believe you are failing is actually the moment your life quietly changes direction. Back then, America was just a distant idea to me. A place I saw in movies. Wide highways. Coffee shops full of people typing on laptops. Friendly neighbors saying, "Good morning." But the real America, I would later discover, is much more complicated and much more interesting than any movie. It has cold winters that feel endless. It has cultural rules nobody explains. And it has conversations that can make you feel like a child again when your English is still learning how to walk. But at 20, I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was this simple fact: my life felt stuck. So I made a strange decision. Instead of studying English like a student preparing for an exam, I started doing something different. Every day, I began telling small stories about my life in simple English. Very simple. Very slow. Sometimes my stories sounded like this. Today was a difficult day. I tried to understand a conversation, but I could not follow everything. But I will try again tomorrow. Not beautiful English. Not perfect grammar. Just honest sentences. And something surprising happened. My brain started relaxing. Neuroscience explains why this works. When language learning connects to real emotion and personal experience, the brain creates stronger memory pathways. In simple words, your brain remembers stories better than grammar rules. So while I thought I was just practicing English, something deeper was happening. I was slowly rebuilding my confidence. At first, it was invisible. Like a tiny plant growing underground. No one could see it. Not even me. But day after day, those small English stories slowly changed the way I thought about failure. Failure stopped looking like a wall. It started looking more like a staircase. Each mistake was one step. Each awkward conversation was another step. And one day, something unexpected happened. An opportunity appeared that would take me to the United States. At the time, it felt ridiculous. My English was still slow. My confidence was fragile. And America felt incredibly far away, not just geographically, but emotionally. But sometimes life opens a door before you feel ready to walk through it. Many people wait until they feel confident. But confidence rarely comes first. Action comes first. Confidence quietly follows. Looking back now, I realized something important about that 20-year-old version of myself. He believed he was failing. But in reality, he was preparing. Preparing for confusing conversations. Preparing for cultural surprises. Preparing for a love story he could never predict. And preparing for a life that would slowly unfold across another continent. If someone had told me then that my broken English would one day lead me to friendships, work opportunities, marriage, and family in the United States, I probably would have laughed. Not because it was impossible. Because it sounded unbelievable. But the strange thing about life is this. The moment that looks like failure often becomes the foundation of your future. At 20, I thought my story was ending early. Instead, it was just beginning. And the next chapter would start the moment I stepped into America, carrying a suitcase, a nervous smile, and a version of English that was still learning how to breathe. And that is where the real story begins. Because landing in America was not the dream I imagined. It was something far more interesting. Something colder. Something more confusing. And something that would test everything I thought I knew about language, culture, and love. Landing in America with fear. Airports are strange places. They are full of excitement, but also full of quiet fear. People arrive with dreams, suitcases, and stories that have not happened yet. Some people walk through the airport like they belong there. Others walk slowly, looking around, trying to understand what their new life might look like. The day I landed in the United States, I was definitely the second type. My suitcase was not very big. My English vocabulary was not very big either. But my curiosity was enormous. The first thing I noticed was the space. America feels big the moment you arrive. The airport hallways seemed endless. The ceilings were high. People walked quickly but calmly, like they had important places to go but were not stressed about it. And everyone was speaking English. Fast English. Not the slow English from textbooks. Not the careful English from language learning videos. Real English. Words connected together like a river flowing downhill. My brain immediately started working overtime. At immigration, the officer looked at my passport, then looked at me. Purpose of your visit? Simple question. 4 words. But in that moment, those 4 words felt like a complicated puzzle. My brain quickly searched through everything it knew. Purpose, visit, purpose, visit. I answered slowly. Work and learning. The officer looked at me for 2 seconds. Those 2 seconds felt like 2 hours. Then he nodded and stamped the passport. That sound, stamp, felt like a door opening. I had officially entered the United States. But entering a country is very different from understanding it. The first week in America felt like watching a movie without subtitles. You understand the big picture, but many small details disappear. For example, greetings. In many places, greetings are formal. But in America, people greet each other everywhere. A cashier says, "How's it going?" A neighbor says, "Hey, how are you?" A stranger in the elevator might say, "Good morning." At first, I believed these were serious questions. So I tried to answer them carefully. "How's it going?" I would pause. "Today is okay. I think." Sometimes the conversation had already ended before I finished answering. Later I learned something important about American culture. Many greetings are not really questions. They are social signals. They mean, "I see you. I respect you." Psychologists call this microconnections. Small moments of friendly interaction that help people feel comfortable in a community. In America, these microconnections happen constantly. But when your English is slow, even friendly moments can feel stressful. My brain was always working. Listening. Translating. Guessing. And sometimes, misunderstanding. One afternoon, I visited a small grocery store. The cashier smiled and said something very fast. I heard something like, "Did you find everything okay?" My brain tried to separate the words. Did you find everything okay? But by the time I understood the sentence, the moment had already passed. So I smiled and said, "Yes," even though I wasn't completely sure what I had just answered. This happened many times during those early days. Simple conversations felt like small exams. And interestingly, neuroscience explains why this feels so exhausting. When you operate in a second language, your brain uses more energy. Studies show that processing a foreign language activates additional areas of the brain related to memory and decision-making. In simple words, your brain is doing extra work all the time. That is why many people feel extremely tired when living in a new language environment. And I felt that tiredness. At night, after a full day of listening and guessing and translating, my mind felt heavy. But something surprising was also happening. Little by little, my ears started adjusting. At first, English sounded like one long sound. Then slowly, it started breaking into pieces. Words appeared. Then phrases. Then meaning. It was like adjusting your eyes in a dark room. At first, everything is black. Then shapes appear. Then details. America itself also began revealing small details. The culture of personal space. The habit of holding doors open for strangers. The casual conversations with baristas. The quiet politeness between people who may never meet again. These small cultural behaviors fascinated me. But there was still one big challenge. Speaking. Listening is one battle. Speaking is another. Because speaking requires courage. And my courage was still fragile. Many immigrants experience this stage. Linguists call it the silent period. It is the phase when learners understand more than they feel comfortable speaking. During this period, people often stay quiet, observing conversations instead of joining them. That was exactly where I was. Watching. Listening. Learning. But life in America does not stay quiet for long. Sooner or later, you must speak. And sometimes the moment that forces you to speak arrives in the most ordinary place imaginable. Not in a classroom. Not in a job interview. But somewhere simple. Like a small coffee shop. A place where a very normal question suddenly becomes a terrifying challenge. Because ordering coffee in America is not as simple as it sounds. There are sizes, flavors, milk options, strange words like latte, Americano, and oat milk. And that small moment, standing in line, trying to order coffee in English, would soon become one of the most embarrassing and important experiences of my early life in America. It was the moment I realized something powerful. Learning English from books had helped me survive. But real life in America was about to teach me how to truly use it. And the lesson would begin with 3 simple words from a smiling barista. What can I get? The day I couldn't order coffee. Coffee shops in America look simple from the outside. A warm light through the window. People sitting with laptops. Someone quietly reading a book. Soft music in the background. It looks peaceful, almost like a small pause from the busy world. But for someone learning English, a coffee shop can feel like a language battlefield. The day this happened, I just wanted a simple cup of coffee. Nothing fancy. Just coffee. I walked into the shop and immediately noticed something interesting about American coffee culture. People were not just drinking coffee. They were talking, working, laughing, planning their lives. Coffee shops in the United States are almost like social living rooms. You can see students studying, friends catching up, freelancers typing on laptops for hours, and baristas moving quickly behind the counter like skilled performers. I stood in line, listening carefully to the conversations ahead of me. The first customer said something like, "Can I get a medium oat milk latte with an extra shot?" The barista nodded quickly. "Sure thing." The next customer spoke even faster. "Large cold brew, light ice." The barista smiled again. "No problem." I felt my brain slowly starting to panic. Medium, large, latte, cold brew, extra shot, light ice. This was not the coffee vocabulary I learned from textbooks. Textbooks usually teach you something simple like, I would like a coffee. But in America, ordering coffee is a small art form. And I was about to perform, without rehearsal. When it was finally my turn, the barista looked at me with a friendly smile. What can I get started for you? Simple sentence. But again, my brain froze for a moment. What can I get? I remembered my plan. Just order coffee. So I said slowly, "Coffee, please." The barista nodded politely. Sure. What size? Size. Another question. My brain searched quickly for options. I remembered hearing people say medium. So I said, medium. The barista continued. Room for cream? Now my brain really stopped working. Room? Cream? Was she asking about space? About milk? About something else? My mind tried to translate each word separately, but the meaning was still unclear. So I did what many language learners do in a moment of confusion. I smiled and said the safest word in English. Yes. The barista poured the coffee. Then she asked another question. Would you like sugar? This time I understood. But I panicked again and answered too quickly. Yes. 2 seconds later I realized something. I don't actually like sugar in coffee. But it was too late. The cup was already prepared. I took the coffee, thanked her, and walked slowly to a small table near the window. Then I tasted it. Very sweet. Not terrible. But definitely not what I wanted. And suddenly I started laughing. Not loudly. Just quietly to myself. Because something funny had just happened. I had traveled thousands of miles, arrived in the United States, and my biggest challenge that morning was a cup of coffee. But that small moment taught me something important. Language learning is not really about vocabulary. It is about confidence. Psychologists call this the communication barrier. It is not the lack of knowledge that stops people from speaking. It is the fear of making mistakes in front of others. And that fear can be surprisingly powerful. Your brain starts imagining embarrassment. Your heart beats faster. Your sentences become shorter. Many people even avoid situations where they might need to speak. But sitting in that coffee shop, drinking my accidentally sweet coffee, I realized something simple. Nobody in that shop cared that my English was imperfect. The barista had already moved on to the next customer. The people around me were busy with their own conversations. The only person still thinking about the mistake was me. That realization felt strangely freeing. In fact, language researchers often explain that mistakes are one of the fastest ways to improve speaking ability. When you make a mistake, your brain creates a strong memory around that moment. Embarrassment, surprisingly, can make learning stronger. Your brain remembers emotional moments better than neutral ones. So that awkward coffee order actually became a powerful lesson. Later that afternoon, I walked past the same coffee shop again. For a moment, I considered avoiding it. But something inside me said, go back. So I walked in again. Same counter. Same menu. Different attitude. When it was my turn, the barista asked again. What can I get started for you? This time I spoke slowly but clearly. Medium coffee. No sugar. And no cream. The barista smiled. You got it. That small conversation lasted maybe 5 seconds. But it felt like a small victory. Not because my English was perfect, but because I tried again. And this is one of the most important lessons for learning any language. Progress rarely happens in big dramatic moments. It happens in tiny situations. Ordering coffee. Asking for directions. Saying hello to a neighbor. Each small interaction strengthens your confidence. Each sentence becomes a small brick in the structure of communication. Looking back now, that coffee shop moment was not embarrassing anymore. It was actually the beginning of something new. Because that same coffee shop would soon become a place where I practiced English almost every day. A place where small conversations slowly became longer conversations. And eventually, a place where I would meet someone unexpected. Someone who would not only change my English practice, but also change the direction of my entire life in America. And strangely, it all started with a cup of coffee that was a little too sweet. Learning English through my own story. Something strange started happening after the coffee shop incident. I stopped trying to sound smart in English. Instead, I started trying to sound honest. Before that day, I believed learning English meant memorizing difficult words, perfect grammar, and long sentences that sounded impressive. But real life in America quickly showed me something different. Most conversations were simple, short, natural. People were not speaking like textbooks. They were speaking like humans. So I created a small daily habit. Every evening, after a long day of listening to English around me, I sat down and told a short story about my day, in English. Very slow English. Very simple English. Sometimes my story sounded like this. Today I went to the coffee shop again. The barista smiled and asked how my day was going. I answered slowly, but she understood me. That made me feel a little more confident. Not impressive English, but real English. And something fascinating began happening inside my brain. Linguists often explain that storytelling is one of the most powerful ways to learn a language. When you connect words with personal experiences, the brain builds stronger neural pathways. In simple terms, stories stick. Grammar rules fade. But stories stay. And my life in America was slowly becoming full of small stories. Some were funny. Some were confusing. Some were slightly embarrassing. But each one gave me a chance to practice. For example, one morning I tried to explain to someone why the winter weather felt so shocking to me. In many places around the world, winter is cold. But American winter can feel serious. The wind bites your face. The air feels dry and sharp. And the first time you see snow falling slowly from the sky, it feels beautiful for about 5 minutes. After that, it becomes very cold. So one evening I practiced telling that story out loud. Today I saw snow again. At first it looks peaceful. But after 10 minutes, my fingers feel like ice. Simple sentences. Clear ideas. The next day, when someone at the coffee shop mentioned the weather, I used my little story. And something amazing happened. They laughed. Not at my English, but at the experience. Because suddenly the conversation was real. This is something many language learners discover too late. Communication is not about perfect sentences. It is about shared experiences. If the story is clear, people will understand you. Even if your grammar is still learning. Little by little, those daily stories began shaping my confidence. At first, I only practiced them alone. Then I started sharing them in small conversations. A neighbor asked how I liked America. I answered with a small story. A coworker asked about my hometown. Another story. The coffee shop barista asked how my morning was going. Another story. Each story was like a tiny training session for my brain. And neuroscience supports this idea. Studies show that storytelling activates multiple regions of the brain at the same time: language processing, memory, emotion, and imagination. That combination makes learning faster and deeper. In other words, when you tell stories, your brain becomes fully engaged. No boredom. No passive learning. Just active communication. But the most surprising benefit was something I did not expect. Those stories were not only improving my English. They were slowly changing how I saw my own life. When you tell your story every day, you begin noticing things differently. Small moments become meaningful. Funny mistakes become lessons. And even difficult days become part of a larger journey. For example, instead of saying, "Today was bad," I would say, "Today was difficult, but I learned something new." That small change in language created a small change in mindset. And that mindset shift matters more than people realize. Psychologists often say that the stories we tell ourselves shape our identity. If you constantly tell yourself a story of failure, your brain starts believing that narrative. But if your story includes growth, learning, and resilience, your brain begins building a different identity. Without realizing it, my daily English practice was slowly rewriting my personal story. The 20-year-old who believed he was failing was becoming someone different. Someone curious. Someone resilient. Someone willing to laugh at his own mistakes. And strangely, the coffee shop became an important part of this process. Not just because of the coffee, but because of the conversations. Small conversations. Short conversations. But real ones. The baristas began recognizing me. "Hey, good morning. How's your day going?" And each time, I practiced another small story. Sometimes about the weather. Sometimes about work. Sometimes about the strange experience of learning a new culture. And one day, during one of those ordinary mornings, something unusual happened. A voice from the next table joined the conversation. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a simple question spoken with curiosity. You're practicing English, right? I turned my head. At the table beside me sat someone who had been quietly listening. Someone with a warm smile and curious eyes. Someone who had noticed my slow storytelling. And that small moment, that simple question from a stranger, would begin a new chapter of this journey. A chapter one definitely did not expect. Because practicing English through my own story was about to lead me into someone else's story. And that story would change everything. Meeting someone unexpected. That question came from the table next to me. You're practicing English, right? The voice was calm, curious, and friendly. Not judgmental. Not mocking. Just curious. I turned my head slowly. A woman was sitting there with a laptop, a notebook, and a cup of coffee that looked much more complicated than mine. Maybe a latte with foam art on top. She had probably been sitting there for a while, quietly working while listening to the small conversations happening around her. Apparently, she had also been listening to my slow storytelling. For a moment, my brain did what it always did when something unexpected happened in English. It froze. Then I nodded. Yes. I am practicing. She smiled. I thought so. Your stories are interesting. Interesting. That word surprised me. In my mind, my English stories were simple and a little awkward. But to her, they were interesting. That small compliment felt bigger than she probably realized. Because when you are learning a language, encouragement becomes fuel. Psychologists call this positive reinforcement. When someone responds positively to your effort, your brain releases dopamine, a chemical that strengthens motivation and learning. In simple terms, encouragement makes the brain want to keep going. She closed her laptop for a moment. So what story are you working on today? That question made me laugh a little. Today's story is about winter, I said slowly. The first winter in America is shocking. She laughed. That is true. Even Americans complain about winter. Her laugh was easy and natural. And something interesting happened inside me at that moment. My English relaxed. When conversations feel safe, the brain stops focusing on mistakes and starts focusing on meaning. This is another thing researchers have discovered about language learning. Emotional comfort reduces something called the affective filter. That filter is the mental barrier created by anxiety and fear. When the filter is high, communication becomes difficult. When the filter is low, language flows more easily. And sitting in that coffee shop, the filter was suddenly much lower. We started talking. Slowly. Casually. She asked where I was from. I told her. She asked how long I had been in the United States. I answered with another small story. I arrived recently. I am still learning many things, including how to survive winter. She smiled again. Winter survival is an important American skill. Then she asked something that surprised me. Why did you start telling stories to practice English? I explained my little habit. How I talked about my day. How I practiced describing simple experiences. How the stories helped my brain organize words. She listened carefully. Then she said something I had never thought about before. That's actually a really good learning method. I raised my eyebrows slightly. Really? She nodded. I studied linguistics in college. Storytelling is one of the best ways to build fluency. That moment felt a little funny. All this time I thought I had invented a strange learning trick. But apparently, science already knew about it. She introduced herself. Her name was Emily. And like many Americans, she spoke with a relaxed friendliness that made conversation feel comfortable instead of formal. Emily worked remotely, which meant the coffee shop was basically her office. That explained the laptop, the notebook, and the complicated coffee. Over the next 20 minutes, we continued talking. Sometimes my sentences were slow. Sometimes I paused to find the right word. But she waited patiently. And something important happened during that conversation. I stopped worrying about sounding perfect. Instead, I focused on telling my story clearly. For example, when I explained why coming to America felt overwhelming at first, I said something simple. In movies, America looks easy. But real life is more complicated. She nodded immediately. That's a very honest description. We talked about culture. About small differences between countries. About how confusing everyday things can feel when you move somewhere new. For instance, tipping in restaurants. Or the strange American habit of putting ice in almost every drink. Or the casual way strangers start conversations. Emily laughed when I mentioned that last one. That's true. Americans talk to strangers a lot. And sometimes it helps, I said. She smiled. Sometimes it does. That sentence hung in the air for a moment. Because in that exact moment, it was proving itself true. A random conversation between strangers was turning into something meaningful. Eventually, Emily checked the time. I should get back to work, she said, reopening her laptop. Then she looked at me again. But I hope you keep telling your stories here. I nodded. I will. She picked up her coffee. Maybe I'll hear the next one. Then she returned to her work. The conversation had lasted maybe 20 minutes. But when I walked out of the coffee shop that day, something felt different. Not dramatic. Not life-changing yet. Just different. Sometimes the beginning of an important relationship does not feel like a big moment. It feels ordinary. Two people talking about winter. 2 cups of coffee on a table. 2 strangers sharing small stories. But psychologists often say that human connections start with something very simple, attention. Someone notices you. Someone listens. Someone responds. And suddenly the world feels a little less lonely. At that time, I did not know how important that coffee shop conversation would become. I did not know that Emily would soon become part of many future stories. Stories about culture. About learning English. About misunderstanding American jokes. And eventually, stories about love. But that chapter had not started yet. For now, something simpler was happening. I had found a place to practice English. And unexpectedly, I had also found someone who was curious enough to listen. Sometimes, that is how the most interesting stories begin. Not with dramatic events. Just with a quiet question from the next table. You're practicing English, right? Our awkward first conversations. The next time I saw Emily at the coffee shop, it did not feel like meeting a stranger again. It felt familiar. Not close yet. Not friendship yet. But something in between. The kind of familiarity that grows from simple, honest conversations. She was sitting at the same table near the window, typing on her laptop. When she looked up and noticed me walking in, she smiled like she recognized a small character from a story she had already started reading. "Morning," she said. That one word felt surprisingly warm. "Good morning," I replied. And just like that, our strange little routine began. I would order coffee. Sit at the table nearby. And sometime between emails and work tasks, Emily would ask about the story of the day. "So," she said that morning, "what's today's story?" I sat down with my coffee and thought for a moment. "Today's story is about grocery shopping," I said. She laughed immediately. "Oh no. Grocery stores are dangerous." "Dangerous?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "Too many choices." That was exactly the word. Choices. American grocery stores felt like giant puzzles to me. In many places, you choose between maybe 2 or 3 types of bread. In America, you stand in front of a wall of bread. White bread. Wheat bread. Whole grain. Organic. Gluten-free. Honey oat. Multigrain. And about 15 others. The first time I tried to buy bread, I stood there for almost 5 minutes just reading labels. Emily laughed as I explained this. "That's very American," she said. "Too many choices." Those small conversations became our language practice. Not formal practice. Just talking about everyday life. And the funny thing was this, our conversations were often awkward. But in a good way. My English was still slow. Sometimes I searched for words. Sometimes I explained ideas in strange ways. For example, one day I tried to describe how confusing American small talk could be. In my country, I said carefully, when people ask questions, they usually want the real answer. Emily nodded. That makes sense. But here, I continued, sometimes the question is just friendly noise. She laughed so loudly that people at the next table looked over. Friendly noise. That's actually perfect. Then she explained something interesting. In American culture, small talk is like social oil, she said. It keeps conversations moving smoothly. That explanation helped me understand many previous experiences. Like when a cashier says, "How's your day going?" They are not asking for a detailed report. They are simply opening a friendly moment. Understanding these small cultural rules slowly made life easier. But our conversations were not always smooth. Sometimes misunderstandings created funny moments. One afternoon, Emily asked about my weekend. I tried to explain that I had spent most of it cleaning my apartment. But instead of saying cleaning, I accidentally said clearing. I spent the weekend clearing my apartment, I told her. She looked slightly confused. Clearing? Yes, I said confidently. You know, removing everything. For a second she imagined something very different. You removed everything from your apartment? I nodded proudly. Yes. Everything was gone. Her eyes widened. You moved out? It took a moment before we both realized the misunderstanding. Then we both started laughing. What I meant was simple. I cleaned the apartment, vacuumed the floor, organized some things. But in English, I had accidentally described something much more dramatic. Moments like that happened often. And instead of feeling embarrassed, I started enjoying them. Because every misunderstanding became a story. And stories made language learning interesting. In fact, language researchers often say that humor is one of the best tools for learning. When people laugh together, stress disappears and memory improves. So those awkward conversations were secretly powerful training sessions for my brain. But something else was also happening. Our conversations were slowly becoming longer. At first we talked for 5 minutes. Then 10. Then sometimes 20. And during those conversations, I noticed something important about Emily. She was curious. Not just politely curious. Genuinely curious. About my experiences. About cultural differences. About what it feels like to build a new life in another country. One afternoon she asked a deeper question. What surprised you most about living in America? I thought carefully before answering. Then I said something honest. How open people are. She tilted her head slightly. Open? Yes, I said. People talk to strangers. People share opinions. People ask questions. She smiled. That's true. In the beginning it was scary, I admitted. But now I think it is beautiful. She seemed to appreciate that answer. And that moment marked a small shift in our conversations. We were no longer just talking about bread choices and grocery stores. We were talking about life. About culture. About how people from different worlds understand the same experiences differently. And every conversation helped my English grow a little stronger. But something even more interesting was beginning to grow too. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. The way many meaningful relationships begin. Through shared laughter. Through curiosity. Through two people slowly learning how the other sees the world. At that time, I still thought of Emily as the friendly person who helped me practice English. Nothing more. But life has a strange habit of hiding important chapters inside ordinary days. Soon, those simple coffee shop conversations would start changing direction. Because one evening, after another awkward but funny conversation, Emily asked a question that shifted everything slightly. Not a big question. Just a casual invitation. So, do you want to continue this conversation somewhere that has better food than coffee? And that small question would begin a new part of the story. A part where English practice would slowly turn into something neither of us had planned. Something warmer. Something deeper. And something that would make my journey in America far more complicated and far more beautiful. Love across cultures. The first dinner with Emily was not supposed to be a big moment. At least, that is what I told myself. In my mind, it was simple. Two people who had already talked many times in a coffee shop were just continuing a conversation somewhere with better food. Nothing dramatic. Nothing romantic. Just dinner. But sometimes life quietly changes direction when you least expect it. We chose a small restaurant not far from the coffee shop. Nothing fancy. Just a warm place with soft lights and the comfortable noise of people talking and plates moving. As we walked in, I noticed something interesting about American restaurants. People talk loudly. Not angry loud. Happy loud. Friends laughing. Families telling stories. Couples discussing their day. The restaurant felt alive. We sat down near a window. For a moment, I felt the familiar feeling of nervousness again. Not because of English this time. Because dinner felt different from coffee. Coffee is casual. Dinner feels more personal. Emily seemed relaxed, though. She opened the menu and smiled. "Careful," she said. "American menus are like grocery stores." "Too many choices?" I asked. Exactly. That small joke helped the conversation begin naturally. But something was different that night. In the coffee shop, we talked in short bursts between her work tasks. At dinner, we had time. Real time. And time changes conversations. Instead of quick questions, we began sharing longer stories. She asked about my childhood. I told her about the place where I grew up. About the sounds of the streets. About family dinners that lasted for hours. About traditions that felt completely normal to me but sounded fascinating to someone who grew up in America. Emily listened carefully. Then she shared her own stories. Her childhood in a small American town. Her parents, who believed strongly in independence. The way many American families encourage their children to make their own decisions early in life. Listening to her stories, I began noticing something beautiful. Our lives were very different. But many feelings were the same. Family. Dreams. Fear of failure. Hope for the future. Psychologists often explain that human connection grows strongest when people share personal stories. Stories allow us to see ourselves in someone else's experience. And that night, our stories were slowly building a bridge between two cultures. Of course, there were also funny cultural surprises. At one point, Emily asked a simple question. "So what was the biggest cultural shock for you in America?" I thought about it carefully. Then I answered honestly. Dating. She almost dropped her fork laughing. Dating? Yes, I said. In movies it looks simple. But in real life, I am still confused. That made her laugh even harder. Okay, she said. Now I'm curious. So I explained my confusion. In some cultures, relationships develop slowly through family and social circles. But American dating culture can feel more direct. People meet. They talk. They decide quickly if they want to see each other again. To me, it felt fast. Emily nodded thoughtfully. That's true, she admitted. Then she looked at me with a playful smile. So this dinner, is it confusing? For a second, I did not know how to answer. My brain searched for the right words. Finally, I said something honest. A little. She laughed again, but this time softly. That's fair. Moments like that made our conversation feel natural. Not perfect. Not scripted. Just two people learning about each other's worlds. And interestingly, my English felt easier than ever before. Language researchers often explain something called emotional motivation. When you genuinely care about the conversation, your brain focuses less on grammar and more on meaning. Communication becomes smoother. That night, I noticed I was speaking more freely. Still slow. Still careful. But more confident. At one point Emily said something that surprised me. You know, she said, your English has improved a lot. I raised my eyebrows. Really? Yes. When we first talked, you paused a lot more. I laughed. My brain was scared. Your brain seems braver now. That sentence stayed with me. Braver. It was a simple word, but it described something real. Because living in another country slowly trains your courage. Every conversation is a small risk. Every misunderstanding is a small lesson. And every connection is a small victory. By the time dinner ended, the restaurant was quieter. People were leaving. Chairs were being moved. The night outside had grown darker. As we walked outside, the cold air reminded me again of my first winter in America. Emily looked up at the sky. You're surviving winter pretty well, she said. I smiled. With help from coffee. And storytelling, she added. We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Then she said something unexpected. You know what I like about your stories? I looked at her curiously. What? They're honest. That word landed softly but deeply. Honest. Not impressive. Not perfect. Just honest. And maybe that honesty was exactly why our conversations worked. Because when people speak honestly, language becomes less important. Understanding becomes more important. As we said goodbye that night, something had quietly changed. We were no longer just two strangers talking in a coffee shop. We were two people who had started sharing parts of their lives. And somewhere between winter stories, cultural misunderstandings, and laughter about dating, a new kind of connection had started forming. Not a dramatic movie moment. Just something gentle. Something growing slowly. But life has a funny way of testing new connections. Just when things begin to feel comfortable, challenges often appear. And soon, my life in America was about to become much more complicated. Because love stories are rarely simple. Especially when they grow between two cultures, two life paths, and a future that neither person can fully predict. The real test of our connection was still waiting. And it would arrive at a moment when I felt like I was failing all over again. When life tested us again. Just when life begins to feel stable, something unexpected often appears. It is almost like the universe enjoys testing your confidence right when you start believing things are finally working out. For a while, my life in America felt like it was slowly moving in the right direction. My English was improving. The coffee shop had become a comfortable routine. And my conversations with Emily were becoming one of the most meaningful parts of my week. But life in a new country is rarely smooth for long. Reality eventually arrives. Bills. Work pressure. Uncertainty about the future. And one day, that reality arrived all at once. The problem started with work. At the time, my job was not glamorous. It was one of those jobs many immigrants take when they first arrive in America. Honest work. Hard work. But not stable work. Some weeks were busy. Some weeks were not. And when work slows down, something else speeds up, stress. I remember sitting in my small apartment one evening, looking at my budget and realizing something uncomfortable. My savings were shrinking faster than I expected. Rent. Food. Transportation. Living in America can be expensive, especially when you are still building your career. For the first time in months, that old feeling from when I was 20 returned. That quiet voice in the back of my mind. The voice that says, maybe you are failing again. Psychologists call this imposter syndrome. It is the feeling that you do not truly belong where you are, and sooner or later people will realize it. Many immigrants experience this. Many language learners experience it too. You start asking difficult questions. Did I make the right decision coming here? Am I strong enough to build a life in this country? And maybe the hardest question of all. What if I have to give up? That week, my conversations with Emily felt different too. Not because she had changed. Because my mind had changed. Stress has a strange effect on communication. When your brain is worried about survival problems, it becomes harder to focus on conversations. Even simple words can feel heavy. One evening at the coffee shop, Emily noticed something. You seem quiet today, she said. I tried to smile. Just thinking. She studied my face for a moment. You usually tell a story when you're thinking. She was right. So I told the story. Not a funny one. A real one. I'm worried about work, I admitted slowly. Her expression softened. Do you want to talk about it? And that moment reminded me of something important. Sometimes strength is not about solving problems alone. Sometimes strength is simply talking honestly. So I explained everything. The unstable schedule. The financial pressure. The fear of not being able to stay in America long term. My English was still slow, but the story came out clearly. Because it was real. Emily listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and thought for a moment. Then she said something simple. "Welcome to adult life." I blinked. "That's it?" She laughed. "Yes. That's it." Then she explained. Everyone goes through this stage. Especially in their 20s. She pointed around the coffee shop. Half the people here are probably worried about money, work, or the future. That idea surprised me. From the outside, many people looked confident, calm, successful. But maybe they were all dealing with their own invisible battles. Psychologists often explain something called the spotlight effect. We believe everyone is watching our struggles closely, but in reality, most people are too busy with their own problems to judge ours. Emily continued. You know what I see when I hear your story? I shook my head. What? I see someone building a life. That sentence stopped my thoughts for a moment. Building. Not failing. Building. She explained her perspective. You moved to a new country. You learned a new language. You built connections. That's not failure. I looked down at my coffee. When you say it like that, it sounds better. It's also true, she said. Then she added something that would stay with me for a long time. Progress is usually invisible when you're living it. Invisible progress. That idea made sense. When you climb a mountain, you often feel tired and frustrated. But if you turn around and look behind you, suddenly you see how far you have come. That conversation changed something in my mind. My situation had not magically improved. The bills were still real. Work was still uncertain. But my perspective had shifted slightly. Instead of seeing problems as proof of failure, I started seeing them as part of the journey. And interestingly, that change in perspective helped my English again too. Because confidence in life often creates confidence in language. Over the next weeks, I focused on small steps. Improving my skills. Looking for better opportunities. Continuing my daily storytelling habit. And continuing my conversations with Emily. But something deeper was also developing between us. Because when two people share difficult moments, their connection often becomes stronger. Not dramatic. Not sudden. Just deeper. And one evening, after another long conversation about life, work, and the strange adventure of adulthood, Emily said something that changed the direction of our story again. You know, she said thoughtfully, your story is becoming interesting. I raised an eyebrow. Becoming? She smiled. Yes. Because every good story needs challenges. She was right. Every meaningful story includes moments when things look uncertain. Moments when the main character wonders if they will succeed. But those moments also create growth. And my journey in America was about to prove that idea in a surprising way. Because the next chapter of this story would begin with something very simple. A new daily habit. A small practice that would slowly change my confidence, my opportunities, and eventually, my entire future. The habit that slowly changed me. The strange thing about life is that big changes rarely begin with big actions. Most of the time, they begin with something very small. A decision. A routine. A habit that seems almost too simple to matter. For me, that habit was still the same one I started when everything felt uncertain at 20 years old. Telling small stories in English. At first, I thought this habit was just helping me practice language. But over time, I began noticing something deeper. The habit was slowly changing how I saw myself. Every evening, I continued my routine. Sometimes at home. Sometimes in the quiet corner of the coffee shop. I would sit down and describe my day in simple English. Very slow. Very clear. For example, one evening my story sounded like this. Today I felt worried about work again. But I also had a good conversation with a customer. I understood everything he said. That made me feel more confident. Simple sentences. But something important was happening inside those sentences. I was paying attention. Psychologists often talk about something called reflective thinking. When people describe their experiences, the brain begins organizing emotions and memories in a healthier way. In simple terms, storytelling helps the brain understand life. And that small habit was doing exactly that. It turned my days into lessons. Even difficult days. For example, one afternoon at work, I made a mistake. A small mistake. But in the moment, it felt huge. My manager corrected me in front of others. Not aggressively. But still, publicly. For a few minutes, my confidence disappeared. The old feeling returned. That voice again. Maybe you are not good enough. But that evening, when I told my story out loud, something interesting happened. Instead of saying, "Today was terrible," I said something different. "Today I made a mistake at work. But I learned how to do the task correctly." That small change in language changed the emotional meaning of the event. Instead of a failure, the story became a lesson. Neuroscience actually supports this idea. The brain processes experiences based on the narrative we create around them. If we describe an event as a disaster, the brain stores it with fear. If we describe it as learning, the brain stores it with growth. Same event. Different story. Different future. Emily noticed this change too. One afternoon at the coffee shop, she asked something interesting. "Your stories sound more confident lately." I laughed. "They still have many grammar mistakes." "I'm not talking about grammar," she said. "I'm talking about attitude." That word caught my attention. Attitude. She explained what she meant. "When we first met, your stories sounded like someone trying to survive." She paused and smiled. "Now they sound like someone building something." That sentence stayed in my mind for a long time. Building something. I had never thought of my life in America that way. But maybe she was right. Because something else was also happening. My English was improving faster. Conversations felt easier. I understood jokes more often. Even my listening had changed. At the beginning, English sounded like a fast river. Now it sounded more like individual drops of water. Words, phrases, meaning. Linguists often explain that language learning works like building muscles. The brain strengthens the connections it uses repeatedly. Every story I told was like a small workout for my brain. And slowly, those workouts created confidence. Confidence at work. Confidence in conversations. Confidence in daily life. But the most surprising part of this habit had nothing to do with language. It had to do with identity. When you tell your story every day, you begin noticing something important. You are not the same person you were yesterday. The 20-year-old who believed he was failing had changed. Not dramatically, but steadily. Like a tree growing slowly over years. The changes were small but real. I handled stress better. I laughed at mistakes more easily. And I stopped comparing myself to everyone around me. Psychologists often warn about something called comparison anxiety. When people constantly compare their progress to others, motivation drops and self-confidence suffers. But storytelling shifted my focus. Instead of comparing myself to others, I compared myself to yesterday. Was I a little braver? A little clearer? A little stronger? If the answer was yes, that was enough. Emily once said something that explained this perfectly. Growth is usually boring while it's happening. I laughed when she said that. Because it was true. Movies show dramatic transformations. Real life shows small habits repeated hundreds of times. Day after day. Sentence after sentence. Conversation after conversation. And then one day, something surprising happens. You suddenly realize that the person you are today would feel impossible to your past self. That realization arrived for me during a simple moment. One afternoon at the coffee shop, a new customer sat near our table. He was visiting from another country and struggling to order coffee. I watched him hesitate, just like I once did. Then I heard something unexpected. Myself. Helping him. Slow English. Clear explanation. Here you can choose small, medium, or large. And they may ask if you want cream or sugar. The conversation lasted only 2 minutes. But when it ended, I realized something quietly powerful. I had become the person helping someone else. Not the confused newcomer anymore. But someone who understood the system. Someone who could guide others. That moment felt bigger than any grammar test. Because it proved something important. Failure had not stopped my journey. It had built it. But the story was still moving forward. Because life was about to bring the biggest change yet. A change that had nothing to do with coffee shops or English practice. A change involving love, commitment, and something even more serious than learning a new language. Building a family in America. And that chapter would soon begin. Building a family in America. Life has a strange rhythm. For a long time, everything feels uncertain. You move carefully, step by step, trying to understand a new place, a new language, a new culture. Every day feels like practice. And then one day, without a dramatic announcement, life quietly changes direction. For me, that change started with something simple. Dinner. Again. Emily and I had already shared many conversations, many coffee shop stories, and many walks after work. Our friendship had slowly grown into something deeper. Not suddenly. Not like a movie. Just naturally. The kind of connection that develops when two people spend enough time learning how the other sees the world. One evening, while we were walking after dinner, Emily asked a question that made me stop for a second. Do you ever think about the future? It sounded like a casual question. But something about the way she asked it felt more serious. Sometimes, I answered. She looked at the street ahead for a moment. I mean, the long future. I understood what she meant. The kind of future that includes big decisions. Where to live. What kind of life to build. Who you build it with. For someone who moved to another country, these questions carry extra weight. It is not just about choosing a career or buying a house. It is about choosing a place to belong. And belonging is one of the deepest human needs. Psychologists often describe belonging as a core motivation in life. People need to feel connected to a community, a place, and other people who share their journey. For a long time, my life in America had felt like temporary exploration. Work. Learning English. Understanding culture. But that night, something shifted. The conversation became about building something permanent. Emily turned to me. Do you see yourself staying here? The question was simple, but my answer was complicated. Because staying in a country is not just about liking it. It is about building roots. Career roots. Social roots. Family roots. I thought carefully before answering. Yes, I said slowly. I think I do. She nodded slightly. Me too. The words were calm, but they carried meaning. Over the next weeks, our conversations began exploring deeper topics. Family. Marriage. Cultural differences. And surprisingly, those differences created some of the most interesting discussions. For example, one evening we talked about how families work in different cultures. In my background, family often plays a central role in major decisions. Parents. Relatives. Community. Many people grow up with strong expectations about relationships and marriage. Emily described something slightly different. In many American families, she explained, parents encourage independence early. Young adults often make their own decisions about relationships, careers, and where to live. Neither approach was right or wrong. Just different. And those differences created fascinating conversations. At one point Emily laughed and said something funny. So basically, if we ever get married, we'll have to combine two cultural operating systems. I laughed. Yes. Like updating software. But behind the humor was something real. Building a relationship between two cultures requires patience, communication, curiosity. Luckily, storytelling had already prepared me for that. Because relationships are also built through stories. Stories about childhood. Stories about values. Stories about hopes for the future. And those stories slowly create understanding. Another interesting change was happening too. My English had become part of our relationship. At first, Emily was someone who helped me practice. Now, English had become the language of our shared life. The language of our jokes. Our arguments. Our dreams. Language researchers sometimes say that language becomes most powerful when it is connected to emotion. When people fall in love in a second language, that language becomes deeply embedded in their memory and identity. And that was happening to me. English was no longer just a skill. It was the language of my life in America. One evening, while we were cooking dinner together, Emily asked another unexpected question. What do you think your 20-year-old self would say if he could see you now? The question made me pause. 20 years old. That version of me believed life was already going wrong. He worried constantly. He doubted his abilities. He felt lost. Now I was standing in a kitchen in America, cooking dinner with someone who had become incredibly important in my life. My English was still not perfect. My career was still developing. But my life felt real. I think he would be surprised, I said. Emily smiled. I think he would be proud. That sentence stayed with me. Because sometimes we forget how far we have come. We focus on what is still missing, instead of noticing what we have already built. Life in America had not been easy. There were cultural shocks, financial stress, language barriers, moments of doubt. But step by step, those experiences had created something meaningful. A life. And maybe even the beginning of a family. But there was still one realization waiting for me. One moment when everything would suddenly make sense. A moment when I would look back at that confused 20-year-old and finally understand something important. Failure had never been the end of the story. It had been the beginning. And that realization would arrive sooner than I expected. Looking back at my 20-year-old self. There is a strange moment that happens in life when you suddenly see your past from a completely different angle. Not because the past changed, but because you changed. For me, that moment arrived on a quiet Sunday morning. Nothing dramatic was happening. No big celebration. No life-changing event. Just an ordinary morning in our apartment. Sunlight coming through the window. Coffee slowly brewing in the kitchen. Emily was sitting at the table reading something on her laptop. I was looking at an old notebook. Not just any notebook. The notebook where I had written my first English stories when I arrived in America. The pages were slightly worn. Some sentences had grammar mistakes everywhere. Some words were crossed out and rewritten again. But each page carried a memory. I started reading one of the first entries. Today I felt very nervous speaking English. I think people do not understand me well. I smiled. Because now, reading those sentences felt almost unbelievable. That person sounded like someone completely different. Emily noticed my smile. "What are you reading?" she asked. "My old English stories." She walked over and looked at the page. "Oh wow," she said. "These are the early ones." "Yes," I said. "The survival phase." She laughed. "That's actually a good title." I kept turning pages slowly. Another story. Another memory. Today I ordered coffee again. I was less confused this time. Emily smiled. "That coffee shop really changed your life." It sounded funny, but there was truth inside that sentence. That little coffee shop had been the place where many chapters of my life began. Learning English. Meeting Emily. Facing my fears. Building confidence. I flipped to another page. This one was written during one of the difficult weeks when work felt uncertain. Today I feel worried about the future. Sometimes I think maybe I am not strong enough for this life. Reading that line made me pause. Because I remembered exactly how that moment felt. The fear. The doubt. The quiet pressure inside my chest. But looking at it now, something became very clear. That fear had not destroyed my journey. It had shaped it. Psychologists often explain something called narrative identity. It means the way people understand their life story shapes who they become. We constantly organize our past experiences into a story that explains our identity. At 20, my story looked like failure. But years later, the same events looked completely different. They looked like preparation. Emily sat down across from me. "Funny how perspective changes things," she said. Yes, I agreed. When you are inside the struggle, everything feels like a problem. And later, she asked. Later it looks like training. That idea made both of us laugh. But it was true. Because the problems that once felt overwhelming had actually taught me many important things. Learning English slowly taught me patience. Working difficult jobs taught me humility. Cultural confusion taught me curiosity. And loneliness taught me how valuable connection really is. Each challenge had quietly built a skill. And those skills built the life I was living now. I continued turning pages in the notebook. Then I reached the last story. The most recent one. Today I helped someone at the coffee shop order their first drink. I realized something strange. I am no longer the confused person standing in line. Emily read that sentence and smiled. That's a big moment. Yes, I said. It felt like graduating from something. Language researchers often describe a stage in learning called automaticity. It is the moment when language stops feeling like a constant puzzle and starts feeling natural. You stop translating in your head. You simply communicate. That moment had arrived quietly for me. Not in a classroom. Not in an exam. Just in a normal conversation helping someone else. But the deeper realization was not about language. It was about life. Looking at that notebook, I suddenly understood something very simple. The 20-year-old who believed he was failing had actually started the most important journey of his life. Without that moment of confusion, I might never have tried so hard to improve. Without that fear, I might never have moved to another country. Without that loneliness, I might never have met Emily. Failure had not blocked the path. It had pushed me onto it. Emily looked at me thoughtfully. So, she said, what would you tell that 20-year-old version of yourself now? I thought about the question carefully. If I could travel back in time for one short conversation, what would I say? Finally, I answered. I would tell him to relax a little. Emily laughed. Good advice. And I would tell him something else, I added. What? Failure is not the opposite of success. She waited for the rest of the sentence. It's the beginning of the story. We sat quietly for a moment after that. Outside, the city was slowly waking up. Cars passing. People walking dogs. Another ordinary day beginning. But inside my mind, something had become very clear. The story that started with confusion at 20 years old had grown into something meaningful. A life. A relationship. A sense of belonging. And there was only one final chapter left to tell. The lesson hidden inside all those years. The simple truth about failure that most people discover far too late. How failure built my life. Life rarely explains its lessons while you are living them. Most of the time, the meaning appears only when you look back. For many years, I believed the most important moment of my story was arriving in America. A new country. A new language. A new life. But now I understand something surprising. The most important moment actually happened much earlier. When I was 20 years old and believed I was failing. At that time, failure felt heavy. It felt embarrassing. It felt like I had already fallen behind while everyone else was moving forward. But years later, sitting in a quiet kitchen in America, looking at an old notebook filled with simple English stories, the truth looked very different. That failure had built something. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But slowly. Almost invisibly. Like a foundation under a house. You do not see the foundation every day. But without it, nothing above it could exist. The truth is this, every part of my life in America grew from those early struggles. Learning English through small daily stories built confidence. Confidence opened conversations. Conversations created friendships. Friendships created opportunities. And somewhere inside those opportunities, I met Emily. The path was not straight. It was messy. Confusing. Sometimes discouraging. But it worked. Psychologists often talk about something called post-traumatic growth. It describes how people sometimes become stronger after difficult experiences. Not because the difficulties were enjoyable, but because challenges force the brain to adapt, to learn, to develop resilience. Resilience is a powerful thing. It means you do not break easily when life becomes difficult. And resilience is usually built in the same way muscles are built. Through resistance. Through struggle. Through repetition. Looking back, my struggles with English were actually a perfect training ground. Every awkward conversation built courage. Every misunderstanding built patience. Every small success built belief. Those lessons eventually became part of who I am. And something else happened too. Failure made me more curious. Instead of fearing mistakes, I began studying them. Why did that conversation feel difficult? What word would have worked better? What cultural rule did I not understand yet? Curiosity transformed mistakes into learning opportunities. And learning opportunities slowly transformed my life. Of course, the story is not perfect even today. Life never becomes completely easy. There are still challenges. Still moments when things feel uncertain. But the difference now is perspective. I no longer see difficulties as proof that something is wrong. I see them as part of the process. Because every meaningful life includes obstacles. In fact, obstacles often reveal the most important strengths inside us. Sometimes I think about that young version of myself again. The 20-year-old who felt lost. If I could sit next to him in a quiet room and share one simple message, it would sound something like this. You are not failing. You are training. Training your patience. Training your courage. Training your ability to keep moving forward even when the path is not clear. The strange thing about life is that the most valuable lessons rarely look valuable in the beginning. They look uncomfortable. They look confusing. Sometimes they even look like failure. But time changes perspective. And perspective reveals meaning. Today, when I walk past the same coffee shop where so many of these stories began, I sometimes stop for a moment. I look at the line of customers ordering their drinks. Some confident. Some nervous. Some speaking English quickly. Others speaking slowly. And sometimes I notice someone standing quietly, looking at the menu like it is a complicated puzzle. Just like I once did. Those moments always make me smile. Because I recognize that stage of the journey. The stage where everything feels difficult. The stage where people wonder if they belong. But I also know something they might not realize yet. This stage is temporary. Confidence grows. Language improves. Life becomes clearer. And one day, without noticing exactly when it happened, you will look back and realize something amazing. The moment you thought you were failing was actually the moment your real story began. And maybe that is the most important lesson of all. Failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is the material success is built from. Every mistake adds experience. Every challenge adds strength. Every step forward, no matter how small, becomes part of the structure of your future. So if life feels confusing right now, if progress feels slow, if you sometimes believe you are behind, remember something simple. Stories take time. And the most interesting ones often begin exactly where people think they are losing. My story began at 20, with doubt and broken confidence. Today it includes a new country, a new language, a relationship, and a life that once felt impossible. Not because everything went perfectly, but because failure quietly built the foundation. And maybe, somewhere inside your own challenges right now, your story is building too. You just cannot see the whole picture yet. Sometimes the biggest turning point in life doesn't look like success. It looks like confusion, mistakes, and a quiet moment when you think you are already behind. But as you've just seen in this real English story practice, the story that begins with failing at 20 can slowly build a completely different future. Life rarely moves in a straight line. It moves through small conversations, awkward moments, unexpected friendships, and lessons that only make sense years later. And sometimes, the very thing that feels like failure is actually the moment your real journey begins. So if you're learning English, or building a life that still feels uncertain, remember this: progress is often invisible while it's happening. One day, you'll look back and realize that every mistake, every slow sentence, and every brave step forward was quietly building the life you have now. If this story resonated with you and helped you practice slow English listening, real-life English conversation, and English through storytelling, make sure you subscribe to the channel. New videos every week will help you learn English through real stories, American culture, and everyday life experiences. Like the video if you enjoyed the story. Comment below, where are you in your journey right now? And subscribe so you don't miss the next real English story practice. Because the next story might sound a lot like yours.